talk to you about some things you might not know about knitting pattern design. This is sort of a one-off vlog in that March has 5 Saturdays. And so I have been trying to plan out my content ahead of time. And I try to do 2 vlogs, a podcast, and a tutorial every month. But now we've got 5 Saturdays. So I just thought I would share some maybe behind the scenes, I don't want to say secrets, because I'm sure some of you know some of these things. And if you're a pattern designer, you know all of these things. But I'm sure there's at least 1 or 2 things here that maybe you didn't know that you might be interested to find out. That again aren't necessarily secrets, but also maybe just are not talked about. I don't know what that was. Like I said, this is kind of a one-off vlog because I needed an idea for today. And as a person who once considered knitting pattern design to be their at least part-time job, I do have, some details about it. I still do design patterns occasionally, but it's very occasionally, and it's really just for fun because I like doing it. It's no longer in an attempt to pay the bills because, not so secretly, it doesn't pay well. All right, so let's get started. Let's see what we come up with. All right, and of course there's coffee. Okay, so number 1 is that the yarn used by pattern designers is often, I won't say always, but very often is given to them for free. So this is why you will find pattern designers often using pretty expensive yarn that, is coming from indie dyers or very small yarn companies that when you are considering buying a sweater, for you is maybe out of your price range. And so this is supposed to be a mutually beneficial relationship where the yarn is given to the designer to create the design, and then they can sort of exchange promoting the pattern and the yarn at the same time. This is especially true for the bigger and more popular designers. If you are just starting out, it may not be true for you. If you are just starting out as a designer, I definitely recommend you check out KnitPick's independent designer program to maybe get a little bit of yarn support there. Obviously, KnitPicks is not the fanciest yarn, but they do have some very nice yarns, and they do have a very nice independent designer program that is very supportive. So another consideration here is that a great number of knitting pattern designers are either relatively small themselves or are producing samples for small models. And so they don't need as much yarn to do that. So it might be completely reasonable, even if they weren't paying for the yarn, it might seem completely reasonable to pay, $100 for a sweater that's going to fit a size 34 bust. But if you're looking at larger sizes, that yarn has suddenly become a lot more expensive. That sweater has become a lot more expensive because you need so much more of the yarn. You may need, up to twice as much of the yarn. So now you're looking at twice the price for the same sweater, but for the larger size. So I know this has, been talked about a lot in that the price points for particularly sweaters, just because they tend to require a lot of yarn, for everybody, and then especially for knitters who need to knit larger sizes, the price point is not always accessible. So just keep in mind that your designer probably got that yarn for free. It is an exchange with the dyer. It's a mutually beneficial relationship, and so the accessibility of that yarn for the consumer is maybe not first and foremost in their mind. There are certainly designers who have gone out of their way to While they are often still using the nicer yarn, we'll put together lists of possible substitutions at lower price points, which I know is helpful for some people. So number one, yarn's usually free. However, designing patterns can get really expensive. So even though the yarn itself is usually free, there's a lot of other things that are involved that are not free and can be pretty pricey. So tech editing is one of the biggest expenses. Tech editors might be charging $35, $40, $45 an hour. And a sweater pattern can take a couple of hours, 3 hours maybe, depending on how complicated it is to edit. That may not seem like a big expense, and for for a very popular designer it's not, but for some of the smaller time designers that is really can really cut into what they are going to be getting at the end of the day from selling that pattern. If the first, I don't know, 10 or 15 sales are just covering the cost of tech editing. There are other things involved that have expenses. Obviously, you need a good set of needles because you're knitting constantly. If you can't knit things on your own, then you're going to have to pay a sample knitter. I don't know anybody that hires, I don't know any independent individual designers who hire photographers. Photographers are very expensive, and that is something that basically companies that produce patterns, so like Knit Picks or the magazines, they can hire photographers. Individual pattern designers, almost never. Photography is very expensive, but if you're not going to hire somebody, you still got to make sure you have a good camera. You've got to make sure you've got some kind of photo editing software. You have to have some kind of pattern layout software. You have to have some kind of charting software. And one of the most annoying things is that in the year 2024, these aren't a one-time expense because everything is a subscription now. So you're not just going to buy that photography or that photo editing software once. You're going to have to pay for that every year. You're going to have to pay for that design layout program every year. You're going to have to renew your Canva subscription every year if you're making, different like ads and things, graphic design elements. So all of that is a repeated expense that is going to add up. I'm sure there are other expenses that are not occurring to me at this particular moment because I'm just kind of winging it. But the yarn might be free, but there are a lot of other expenses involved before your friendly neighborhood pattern designer is actually going to start earning an income from their patterns. Oh, that's the other one. Fees. So in addition to the subscriptions for all of this software and things that you need, Ravelry and PayPal get a fair chunk. Ravelry is relatively reasonable. PayPal takes a big chunk. So every time you sell a pattern, you got to pay a fee to Ravelry and you got to pay a fee to PayPal before you start getting any money. So that is another thing that really starts adding up. So you might see the price of the pattern is $9, but Ravelry is going to get 30 cents of that, and PayPal is going to get 70 cents of that. So already, that's almost 10%. I'm not going to do the math. That's almost 10% of $9. Almost 10% you're going to lose right away in fees. Somewhat connected to that, most independent pattern designers, it's a one-woman show. So for the most part, pattern designers are going to pay for the services that they have to have, which is basically tech editing, and are not going to be able to afford to purchase any other services, and so everything else is going to be in their lap. The photography, the photo editing, the pattern layout, the marketing, the newsletter writing, the graphic design creation for the things in the newsletter and on Instagram and everywhere else, answering emails from customers, so the pattern support, the uploading, the updating, if there's pattern revisions, all of that is basically one person. And one person who probably just started designing patterns because they liked designing patterns, but then found out there were about a bajillion other things they had to do to go along with it. And some, maybe are fun and some are not. There's a lot of different things that go into designing knitting patterns other than just knitting and writing the pattern. And it's all basically on one person, most likely, who has absolutely no training in probably most of those things. And they're just learning and winging it and figuring it out on the go. So things to keep in mind when you're buying patterns. Your pattern designer, is a pattern designer and didn't necessarily consider that she was also going to be an accountant and a graphic designer and a photo editor and a content creator and all of these other things that go along with it. Test knitting isn't actually for catching mistakes. So the catching mistakes part is supposed to come from the tech editor, who is going to sit and do the math and make sure all of the numbers are correct and make sure that there's no typos and that everything is laid out and you're not missing a chart, or that is all supposed to be the tech editor. The test knitter really serves another purpose. So it's more about reading the pattern, and are they able to interpret the way that you've written things and come up with the thing they're supposed to come up with. So is your pattern, does it make sense to your test knitters? Is it confusing your test knitters in any way? Is something open to interpretation and could result in two different things? That is the major thing. Also, to confirm that the amount of yarn given is correct. And this is one of the reasons it is so important for test knitters to work to gauge, because you're trying to make sure, you can only estimate the yarn based on what you have produced, your one sample. And your test knitters are going to make sure that you have given a correct amount of yarn for all of the different sizes. And if they're not working at the same gauge, that yarn estimate is going to be off. So that is another function for test knitters. And something I guess has developed a little bit more recently because it is becoming more important, is showcasing whatever you've created on different bodies. So on small busts and large busts and short and tall and just different shapes and sizes, seeing how XYZ looks on different bodies. This has really become a thing, especially in the age of Ravelry, where you're able to go in and look at all of the different projects that have been made using this pattern, and see, the model is one person, and you want to make sure the sweater, is still going to look good if you are not a size 2. So more recently, designers have been using test knitting more as an opportunity to, again, like I said, just make sure the pattern is clear and accessible for knitters, but also to see that sweater. Usually, hats look the same on most people, socks look the same on most people, but particularly when we're talking about sweaters, to see that sweater on different bodies, because the designer cannot possibly produce multiple sweaters of a certain pattern and then hire models for all those different sizes and then photograph all of those different, that's not within the scope of the abilities of most pattern designers. To go along with that, test knitting is usually not paid, and this is a big point of contention because in theory, yes, they absolutely should be paid. On the other hand, very few pattern designers are making the kind of money that would allow them to pay test knitters for every pattern they produce. So it gets a little fuzzy. Most pattern designers are going to offer test knitters some form of compensation. It's usually a free pattern. They may be able to offer you a discount on the yarn if you use the yarn in the pattern, and they've made arrangements with the company that provided the yarn. But most of the time, test knitting is not going to be paid. It's really important that you only test knit things that you actually want. So if you saw X and this pattern came out today and you were going to, would you want to knit it? And if that's the case, then go ahead and say, I would like to test knit this. Because what you're getting there is early access to something you would buy anyway. And because of some of the, righteous response to the fact that test knitters aren't paid, a lot of designers have tried to be more lax in the requirements for testing, because you're basically doing them a favor. Okay, I got 4 more. All right. The sizing and patterns isn't just made up. There are standards that should be, following in some way. So originally, basically what designers had to go on was the Craft Yarn Council standards, which was basically a chart listing, for this bust circumference, this is the average waist circumference, hip circumference, armhole depth, back neck width, back length, all of those things. Designers weren't just pulling numbers out of the air, or they shouldn't be. There were always standards. However, as there's been more of a push toward size inclusive design, it became apparent that the CYC standards were not enough. They were not accurate and they did not scale high enough. So some other designers started creating their own standards. I know Isolde has a really nice set of standards. I think there are some other ones, maybe Faina Goberstein and Kim O'Brien, I think. And there may be another one, but they've all done some, actual surveys of actual knitters and come back with some updated and more inclusive standards. So designers aren't just making it up. There is information available to them so that they can create garments that are for the average. The other part of this, of course, is that humans tend not to be average. There's no rules. All patterns, can only do so much. So even if it has 10 sizes, that's 10 average women of that bust circumference. And there can be a lot of variation in there. But there are standards that things are based on. And if you are looking to improve the fit of your sweaters, it's a great idea, and I do get into this in my sweater siren class, to get your measurements and compare them with the averages in some of these standards. And that way you'll know that your shoulder width or your armhole depth is not the same as the average person. And that's something you will probably have to adjust in pretty much every pattern because they're all based on, 2 or 3 sets of standards that are available. I'll try to include links in the box down below, but I'm winging it, so who knows? I don't know what's going on. All right, so speaking of standards which exist, grading patterns is not just taking your formula from box C1 and stretching it out across all your sizes. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, those formulas have to be tweaked to accommodate stitch patterns. So unless you're talking about something that's just plain stockinette, there are some kind of stitch patterns that have to fit in there. But 2, those formulas have to be tweaked because proportions don't remain standard across all the sizes. So let's say you're working on your size 1, which is a 32-inch bust and a 10-inch neck circumference. And then you got your size 10, which is a 64-inch bust. So the difference between 32 and 10, 22. If you got a 64-inch bust, you don't have a 42-inch neck. That would be ridiculous, right? So you can't just extrapolate out your formulas because those proportions don't remain. They don't stay. They're not set. Okay? You have a difference between a 32-inch bust and a 64-inch bust. That's a 32-inch difference, but you're not going to have a 32-inch difference between your necklines. So that also has to be accommodated for in your formulas. You can't just, it usually works for about the first 4 or 5 sizes. It usually works. You've got maybe a 1/2 inch difference between each neck circumference and then a 4-inch difference between bust, and that holds up. After that, it doesn't anymore. And so you have to make adjustments, and it's not as easy as just moving things across the row. And so then once you have, you figured out that you can't have a 42-inch neck on a 64-inch bust, you give it a 14-inch neck instead, which is much more reasonable. But now you've got to increase from 14 to 64 in roughly the same space. You're going to increase from 10 to 32. So the difference between armhole depth also doesn't differ that much. The smallest is about 7 inches and the longest is 10, maybe 11 if you're talking about like something that's supposed to be very oversized. So you have a lot of increases to make in a relatively the same amount of space. And so that's another thing that's got to be tweaked. So while I agree that size inclusivity is important and it should be something that people are working toward, I do want to dispel the notion that it's just as easy as expanding your formula and people just don't want to do it, because it's not. It can get very complicated. Trying to, and it's especially true for, it's true for all the sizes, but there are some sizes that the shaping is a little bit more customizable, and then you've got like a raglan, which is this is where it is, and this is how much space you have. You don't have as much wiggle room, so it can be a lot harder to get those rates of increases to fit into the size and the length and to accommodate your stitch patterns. So that's not to say it shouldn't be done. It absolutely should, but let's not pretend it's as easy as just like boop, boop, boop on a spreadsheet, because it's not. The first week after a pattern comes out, maybe 2, is the absolute most important. After that, that pattern is maybe 2 weeks, like I said, but after that, that pattern is not going to see much interest unless it gets, picked up for a knit along for somebody, for a podcast that's really popular, or some yarn harlot or Clara Parks or somebody very famous, happens to knit it and starts sharing photos. Unless, one of those things happens, almost all of the sales of a pattern are going to come during the first week, maybe 2. This is why designers are constantly releasing patterns, because you have to keep getting that burst of initial sales from the pattern to really make any kind of decent money. So just as an example, I just did my taxes for 2023 this morning. And as I said, I am not really releasing patterns regularly anymore. I think I released like 2 or 3 new ones last year, and then 1 with knit picks. One of those was free. All my patterns are in the link in the description box below. But I have a catalog of over 100 patterns, almost all of them available on Ravelry. And I sold a grand total of $2,000 worth of patterns last year across all of the sites. So Ravelry, Payhip, Love Knitting, and Knit Picks, the patterns I have available through them. I have over 100 patterns, and they're just not seeing any traction, any interest, even though they're there and available. And even patterns I've had that were really popular that first week or 2, which would be Torbellino and Diego. So that first week, maybe 2, is all really that designers get to make any kind of substantial money from that pattern. And then after that, it goes in the library and you get a few sales here and a few sales there, and otherwise it is kind of useless. So that is why you're constantly going to be seeing designers releasing, you know, a new pattern every month at least, because they've got to keep getting something out there, something new and fresh, something to put on Instagram, something that is exciting and has some kind of enthusiasm around it. Has to be done during that first week or two, and then that's it. That's all she wrote. It's just hanging out there, not doing much of anything, which, when you think about how much work goes into them, can be really depressing. So I try not to think about that too much. All right, and the last one is that what you're designing sometimes really doesn't matter as much as the look and aesthetic. Which is why some very popular designers can design some really basic things and get a lot of traction from them, because knitters aren't actually buying the pattern. They're buying the aspiration. They're buying this lifestyle that they see and want. They're buying the fandom that they want to be a part of. You could have two designers sell the exact same thing, but if one has sort of the popular aesthetic look going for her and the other doesn't, their results are going to be very different. So along with this is that a lot of, you know, it used to kind of be that you would become a designer and then maybe you would become popular because of your designs or your aesthetic. Now what we're seeing more is people who are already popular. They've already created an audience. They've already created a brand through their podcasts or through their TikTok or their Instagram reels or whatever content they're creating. They've already built this audience, this captive audience, and then they're going to start designing things. And again, here you're going to see sometimes really basic stuff. But because they have this audience that wants to be a part of it, that really basic stuff is going to sell really well, even though it's, you know, it's not necessarily new or revolutionary or, you know, it's not, it doesn't reflect some, you know, some brilliant new fashion aesthetic, or, you know, it's just maybe a plain raglan pullover or, you know, just a basic pair of ribbed socks. But having that captive audience, it can be very powerful. So just something to some food for thought that well, maybe not everybody will agree with, but I definitely think if you are looking for it, it's something that you can see where sometimes the what isn't as important as the who. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know. You know, if you are fortunate in that you are been able to, you know, speak to people in a way that they're interested in a way that they can connect with, and that's a really valuable skill. And even if what you're designing isn't super innovative, your ability to connect with people is something worthwhile, something that people appreciate. So, you know, they can't pay you for being, they can't pay you for being like accessible and friendly and someone who feels like a friend to them. That would be weird. But they can support you by purchasing your designs. So just some food for thought is that, you know, the knitting community is not immune to the aesthetic and the brand and the lifestyle considerations that we definitely see in other communities as well. It's not always about brilliant, innovative designs, great fashion talent. Sometimes it's about other things, and that's that's fine. But it is also something to be aware of when we're considering, you know, how we can make our community more accessible to people who have spoken up and said that they don't feel like the community is as welcoming or as open to them. You know, because I do think that the two are probably related. All right, there you have it. 10 things you probably didn't know about knitting pattern design. I just made this list this morning, so this is not one of my more well thought out vlogs, but that's what you get, a wild card for March, because we've got 5 Saturdays this month somehow. I promise you next week I will be back with a much more well thought out vlog. But if you did enjoy this, I hope you give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe. Lots of great knitting content here on the Media Peruana Knits channel. New videos every Saturday. If you would like to support the channel, you can tap the join button down below, find out more about that. It was also greatly appreciated. If you are looking for me on social media, you can find me on Ravelry and Instagram as Media Peruana, and I will see you next time.